Every railway company in Victorian and Edwardian Britain had their own unique personification and style. Through every aspect, from the architecture and signalling to the locomotive's outline and the way things were painted. It's a big part of what makes the railways of this time so fascinating. Every one of them has a distinct story and atmosphere. The London, Brighton and South Coast Railway is no exception to this. Many enthusiasts count this company as one of their favourites, with a history and development that makes up for, in historical significance and beauty, what it may lack in size. For the most part, the Brighton follows a path of development typical with its contemporaries. That is, until you look at the rolling stock. William Stroudley, the successor to the chaotic J.C. Craven, was an early advocate of standardization, and it shows throughout everything he would create for the Brighton. The good stock is very typical of this, with components, dimensions, and other aspects shared between different types of wagon. Despite this, the outline of the wagons would not change throughout the remainder of the LBSCR's independent life. From Robert Billington succeeding Stroudley after his sudden death, through Marsh and the associated scandal of his departure, and then Lawson Billington stepping in as a temporary substitute until being made the official successor, no major modifications to the company's good stock would occur for anything other than the brake vans and vehicles designed and ordered from outside firms. You see, the men we now refer to as the company's chief mechanical engineers had a good amount on their plates throughout the pre-grouping period, and were required to deal with far more than just the locomotives, their maintenance, and the workshops tasked to build and repair them. On the Brighton itself, these men also had to handle the rolling stock, the permanent way, the signalling, additions to the railway such as new extensions, increasing running line capacity, infrastructure projects, even the company's marine interests, the management of their staff, and resources all fell under the management of what was then termed the locomotive superintendent. It's no wonder that many of the men who held this position were worn down quite rapidly. The amount of responsibility meant that certain aspects of development became stifled. The wagon fleet of the Brighton was just one example. The outline Stroudley laid down would be tweaked and improved upon, with the likes of steel underframes and proper braking to all wheels being the most noticeable. But by 1923, the company's wagon fleet was decades behind its contemporaries. Now, although this was detrimental, the major problem of this stagnation was the fact that the company never adopted the standards of the RCH for its good stock, and it was the only one of the mainline railway companies of Britain not to do so. The RCH, or Railway Clearing House, was an organization originally set up to manage the allocation of revenue collected by the pre-grouping railways of Great Britain. But it went on to become the main regulatory body of the railways, managing their running and setting general guidelines and standards so that the operation of services between the different railways could run as smoothly and trouble-free as possible. Part of this included setting standards for the components of wagons, which at times could travel across the country depending on what was being carried. If said vehicle should require repair at that point, its owners would have to ship parts for its repair to wherever it had broken down. The standardization of items like bearings, axle boxes, brake rigging, etc. meant that the vehicle could be repaired much more easily and then quickly gotten back on its way again. The result was that the majority of the goods wagons on the Brighton were a bit of a liability when traveling over other companies' metals. And within just a few years of becoming part of the Southern Railway in 1923, any vehicles not to RCH specifications may have been subject to quick replacement. But the Southern was very notable for how far it could stretch its resources, and essentially recycle much of what it had inherited. What happened with the Brighton's rolling stock would eventually result in its longevity. They were utilized two ways by the Southern. The first was in departmental use. This meant they would be kept off the mainline network and only used to transport materials around fixed locations. But the other was much further reaching. A number were transferred for use on the Isle of Wight. The island's railways had never been well off financially, and it became one of the few places where the grouping was welcomed with open arms, as it meant that a sorely needed injection of cash could come from the new company. The Southern immediately began a process of budget upgrading for the island network, transferring London and Southwestern O2s and slightly older rolling stock to supplement and start replacing much of the older, worn-out, and overworked vehicles of the Isle of Wight and Isle of Wight Central Railways. LBSCR rolling stock became a core component of the island's railways, both coaches and wagons. Despite everything mentioned, those transferred were generally vehicles constructed after 1900, and as a result they were still relatively modern. Basing them on the Isle of Wight meant they could be used as intended and remain self-contained. Right up until steam was withdrawn from the island network in 1966, the LBSCR's coaches and wagons formed an integral component of the daily operation of the railway. Five-plank wagons, originally intended for general goods, became the ubiquitous coal wagons of the island. Some goods vans were converted for use as fish and luggage vans, as well as their original intended purpose. Cattle wagons were later converted to general goods and luggage vans when the Great Depression killed off the island's cattle traffic. Even the open carriage trucks had some form of reuse, as they were heavily utilized by ride works to move around bulky components like locomotive boilers. The cattle wagons became notable as the last surviving wooded body vehicles of this type in service, and one today is part of the preserved Island Railways wagon fleet, forming the only surviving pre-grouping cattle wagon. Certainly, if it weren't for the unique and limiting characteristics of these vehicles, we probably would not have what has survived in the preservation today. Thanks to the efforts of the Isle of Wight Steam Railway since it formed in 1966, a relatively wide selection of Brighton rolling stock can still be seen running on the preserved section of the former Isle of Wight Central Railway, and forms a thankfully extant example of both the railways of the Isle of Wight and a somewhat chaotic and unique story of the pre-grouping railways of Britain.